So first, I just have a couple of questions for the audience. First, I'm wondering how many of you self-identify as universal owners? Nobody? Okay. Who here has a pension fund? Okay. And just if you could keep your hands up, and who is under 60 also? Just to, yeah. And just to compound things, who knows that they have passive investments of any kind? Okay, so that kind of covers off us all. So in this room at least, we are probably all universal owners. That's one of the things I'm going to be arguing. And the title of my paper is Universal Ownership Theory in the Anthropocene. And the idea here is that this might be the kind of paradigm shift that we need to address our moment in history in which we're facing a bunch of catastrophic threats. Just to get into this a little bit more, so universal ownership, the typical definition is of very large long-term funds, such as pension funds or sovereign wealth funds and the like. And these funds are, sometimes they have just a long-term investment horizon, sometimes it's infinite. And the idea there is that they can't diversify their way out of risks. They can't stock pick their way out of risks because externalities from any given stock, the costs end up getting picked up elsewhere in their portfolio. So in financial terms, I guess, they care a lot more about beta than they do about alpha. And put another way, their interests align a lot more with governments than with, a high-frequency trader or a stock-picking short-term investor might, which kind of shifts a whole bunch of things that might affect how they think and hopefully how they act. So we're in an era in which government regulation has not gotten us to the stage at which we are adequately addressing the catastrophic risks we're facing. We have, I think, a bunch of other issues relating to climate change that we might not discuss quite as much. I'll just give a couple of examples to terrify us all. One of them is soil. We are running out of topsoil at an alarming rate. And this could end up affecting our entire food supply, obviously. There are some estimates that say we have 40 harvests left, maybe 50. So this puts it well within the window of the investment horizon of the average universal owner. But also, just that is a catastrophic potential outcome that's currently not really being addressed through the financial system or otherwise, indeed. The other is forced migration, and I just want to distinguish really sharply between voluntary and forced migration, because I'm very much in favor of voluntary migration. Forced migration, on the other hand, is also catastrophic often. And if you think about the political destabilization that emerged from, a few million migrants, forced migrants in Europe a few years ago, you can start to imagine what might happen with some of the estimates that have been put forward by international bodies that track this sort of thing. Some of the estimates go as high as 1 billion forced migrants by 2050, but I'm hoping those are well off. Some of the estimates, though, do tend to cluster around the 200 million mark, and that's completely unimaginable. And it doesn't seem likely that political stability would be able to hold up in the wake of that. So these are the sorts of things that are not being adequately managed at the moment. I'm with the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, and the lens there is, which are the things that can kill us all. Climate change is one of those that, even if it doesn't have that existential threat to us, which is arguable itself, there is a definite risk of civilizational collapse. And, sorry, this is such a depressing talk. The thing about civilizational collapse is that your portfolio isn't worth anything at that point. So as a universal owner, even if there's a fairly small risk of that, arguably you should be worrying about it, especially if you have an infinite time horizon, which is true of many of the largest funds in the world, such as the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, for example. So we're in this moment in history in which we have unprecedented risk around climate change. We're also seeing a bunch of political instability that's in some ways linked, in some ways not, but it's very clear that inequality is another huge issue that we have to deal with. And the paradigm of universal ownership theory, I think, really adequately addresses both. So I'm really focusing on climate change and inequality in this piece. Now, it's worth talking a little bit about a couple of things that could be considered barriers, but that also kind of point us in a direction for how we might start to think about universal ownership theory. So one is returning to Elinor Ostrom's work around common resources and the management thereof. Her work, so Elinor Ostrom, for those of you who don't know, is the only woman to win the so-called Nobel Prize for Economics. And her work, is the counter-argument to the tragedy of the commons concept. So yes, there can be a tragedy of the commons. There can also be really well-managed commons that continue in perpetuity in a healthy state. And if you look at the list of her preconditions for a well-managed commons, it actually works really well with universal ownership theory. I'm not going to get into the detail here because we don't have time, but there are things like having a common belief, having an ability to work together and cooperate around common rules, etc. And if you look at all of those, the only thing that really doesn't apply is that it's usually better if it's a small group. And universal owners, as we can see from earlier, is probably everyone in this room, and certainly a large proportion of the world's pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, university endowments, foundations, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's one helpful lens through which to see the theory. It could be perceived as a barrier. Equally, my PhD concerned the education of economists and business school education, and frankly, that form of very standardized, at least in the global north, standardized form of economics and finance education, I would view as a barrier in our current situation. There are a bunch of assumptions. Again, I won't go into all of these, but there are a bunch of assumptions and concepts that are taught in these programs that aren't necessarily conducive to adopting a universal ownership lens. Just as one illustrative fact, there have been a whole bunch of really interesting studies around the effects of economics education on students, and there are several that have also teased out the indoctrination effect, so you can kind of see the difference that it makes, just the exposure to economics education, not just the self-selection of who decides to go in the first place. And exposure to economic concepts and theories can change how students behave under experimental conditions. That's a little worrisome because what it tends to do is to reinforce a frame of humans as atomized individuals who work from a place of self-interest, whereas humans are very much governed by social norms. I view us as a social mammal. We can be extremely cooperative. We're capable of a level of cooperation that's kind of staggering if you think about it, and there are plenty of examples all around the world of that. So I do think that's one other element that could be viewed as a barrier, but is also something we can work with to properly express universal ownership theory in the finance and economics professions. And then one thing that comes out of that is that in social science, there can be what's called the double heuristic, which is that theories that are taught can become believed and therefore become reality. The Black-Scholes theorem, for example, was first proposed and wasn't accurate at first, but became so because of its use, its widespread use, but also the belief in its accuracy. And there are many more examples like that. We can think of several cases in which humans' beliefs about the market ended up manifesting themselves in the behavior of the market. So I would say that there's at least the potential for universal ownership theory to be believed by universal owners, and therefore the market start to react to that reality that's being created, sort of thing. So for example, a company that wanted to do something particularly terrible to the environment might imagine that there would be a response from universal owners that would just prevent them from wanting to go through the trouble of litigation and votes against their directors and so on and so forth. So you can kind of see how that might follow through. In terms of very practical things that a universal owner could do in the current landscape, and when I talk about a universal owner, I really mean a cooperative group of them so that they can actually get the proper clout that's required. I think that there needs to be much more attention paid to primary markets as opposed to secondary markets. And just to dig into this for a moment, the public equity is the secondary market. When you sell a share as a shareholder, you are selling it to another shareholder. The money doesn't go back to the company. This is horribly oversimplified, I realize, but the impact of your actual asset allocation within the secondary market is, I would argue, kind of negligible, and there are other ways of having impact in that way. So in other asset classes, asset allocation, I think, is crucial to shifting the kind of capital that we need to shift in order to get where we need to go. But within public equity, for example, and the secondary market and bonds and so on, I think you need a different strategy. So just to come back to the primary market for a second, that includes, or I include in that, bank lending, which is huge. Michael's great talk about that earlier is an excellent example of what needs to change. And also debt denial. So any new debt issuances, this is where you really get to affect companies' behavior. When they come to the market, sometimes a couple of times a year to issue new bonds, that's when you can affect how much capital they have to work with to expand their operations or whatever else. I also think it's important to look at the transition from the primary to the secondary market. So, IPOs aren't happening so much these days, but I do think there needs to be a real carbon lens on new companies being added to the stock market, because in a sense, what matters much more than which particular stocks you own is the composition of the stock market as a whole. Which kind of gets me into some of the things that might be done to influence that, such as delisting companies. This has been a proposal in the UK recently, delisting companies that just are not willing to start to meet standards around this, and voting against directors and much more aggressive measures like this that might actually change the behavior of boards and companies and their management. I know that's well beyond what is considered acceptable right now, but again, if you return to that risk of civilizational collapse and therefore complete disappearance of portfolio for a universal owner, this might not seem like so crazy a series of measures. So in addition to that, another form of engagement is with policymakers. This is already happening to a certain extent, but it's worth just emphasizing that a universal owner's interests really do line up with those of government. And so that's where you can start to see a supportive role played by investors helping governments to do what would actually address these major threats. And I would say that when we look at all of these measures, what we're actually pushing for, we need to use what I'm referring to as ungameable metrics, because we get a lot of disclosure, we get a lot of frameworks and so on and so forth. I'm not criticizing those, but I do think, if we return to Greta Thunberg's analysis on this, the only measure that really matters is how much carbon dioxide equivalent we're emitting into the atmosphere. It's great to hear whether the company has disclosed everything or whether they have a voting policy on blank, but what really matters is these sorts of things. So for example, that would include disclosing absolute and absolute emissions as well as emissions intensity, scope 3 in addition to scope 1 and 2 emissions, all the way through the supply chain. And particularly, and I think this is critical, the percentage of their capital expenditure that's going towards that transition plan that they also hopefully will have published and socialized, as well as their R&D spend. So without those are really the indicators that you need to tell whether a company is serious about transitioning to where we need to go. And I suppose that, and this is a critique that'll probably make me a few enemies in the audience, but you know, I worry about a lot of the kind of ESG investing that has become really common, probably makes up the bulk of what's available. It typically involves stock picking within public equity. Often it's not accompanied by appropriate voting standards, proxy voting standards, or anything like that. So I view it as really inadequate to the challenge that we're facing. And I think that one of the measures that we need to see as an ungameable metric, and this is actually difficult to measure, so more work needs to be done, but is around additionality. So I would argue that there is little to no additionality in purchasing a listed share in a green energy company, for example. Nor does it arguably hurt a company that you would want to you know, have kind of a managed decline by selling their shares, and unless you announce it and at least there's social pressure. But I don't see that happening with a lot of ESG funds, and I find that problematic. So in addition to these kinds of practical measures that universal owners might make, I think there's huge power in forward signaling. So they can make announcements saying, you know, in 2 years, we're going to be demanding this, and the measures that I just mentioned can be the results of that flow from any intransigence on the part of companies that kind of don't heed the warning. But you can start to kind of put in place markers over the next 10 years, say, and markets will respond. If it's a legitimate enough group with enough capital behind them, you could actually imagine that markets would begin to respond even ahead of whatever deadline was set. Finally, I think that in all of this, what's often left out is what's largely missing from this room, which is the global south. And that's where a lot of the forced migration is going to come from as well. So it's highly relevant even from a self-interested perspective. I think that there needs to be a duty of expansion for universal owners, for them to help set up and support pensions, public pensions, for example, in the global south, so that there are more universal owners, more people with long-term security that comes from something like a pension. So I think that's critical, not just as kind of a risk measure, but as a moral component of this. And I think that's one piece that shouldn't be lost. I think it totally makes sense. It's the paradigm shift that would be required to address these significant issues that we're facing, but I also think there's moral weight behind it, which is something that we tend to avoid in finance more generally, but I think would be a healthy addition. So with that, I'll finish, and ask for questions.